The coffee mug hit the counter so hard it cracked. Not shattered. Cracked, a single hairline fracture running from the rim down toward the base. The kind of damage that doesn't stop you from using something. It just reminds you every single time you pick it up that something once went wrong. Ruth Callahan looked at it for a long moment before she filled it anyway and carried it to the window booth. Because in Millhaven Ridge, Wyoming, you didn't throw out a good mug over a crack. You just learned to hold it a little more carefully. She had no idea that mug would still be sitting on that same counter 4 months later, and that everyone in town would know exactly what it meant. Nobody in the diner that morning knew the woman in the gray wool coat. She had walked in at 6:14, ordered black coffee and a plate of eggs over easy, and taken the booth by the window without asking anyone's permission. The way people do when they've learned that drawing attention is the fastest way to lose an advantage. She wrote in a small leather notebook between bites. She did not check her phone. She did not look up when the bell over the door rang. Nobody in that diner knew that the quiet woman, writing in a notebook, was Deputy Director Adele Marsh of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, 48 years old, sworn into the role 11 weeks earlier. Traveling 2,000 miles from Washington without an escort, without a badge visible on her coat, without so much as a government-issued pen. 20 minutes later, the sheriff of Colton County walked through that same door, looked at her exactly once, and decided, before she had said a single word, that she was a problem that needed solving. By 6:41 that morning, in front of 11 customers, 2 of them filming on their phones, Sheriff Wade Garner had her hands cuffed behind her back so tightly, the metal left a mark that lasted 3 days. He smiled while he did it. He told the room it was for their own safety. He had absolutely no idea that the woman he was dragging toward his patrol car outranked every person he had ever answered to in his entire career, and that within 72 hours, his badge, his pension, and the town that had worshipped him for 22 years would all be gone. But to understand how a man loses everything in a single Tuesday morning, you have to go back 3 days, to the moment a black government sedan almost pulled into Colton County, and didn't. Millhaven Ridge sat where the plains gave up, and the mountains hadn't quite started yet. A town of 2,000 and change. 1 blinking traffic light, and a Baptist church with a bake sale banner that had been advertising the same bake sale for 6 weeks, because nobody had gotten around to taking it down. It was the kind of place where everyone recognized your truck before they recognized you, where the diner opened at 5:30, and the last customer usually left by 9, and where the sheriff's department had exactly 1 sheriff, whose name meant something, and 4 deputies, who mostly did what he told them. Wade Garner had run that department for 22 years. His picture hung in the hardware store, the elementary school gymnasium, and the wall behind the counter at Ruth's Diner, a younger version of himself shaking hands with a governor who had been out of office for over a decade. People trusted him the way people trust a habit, without examining it too closely, because examining it meant admitting they might not like what they found. He called what he did keeping order. A few people, quietly, over the years, had called it something else. None of them had said it loud enough for it to matter. She had learned to read a town the way other people read a resume. On the drive in, before the sun had fully cleared the ridge line, she'd counted things without meaning to. 3 churches and 1 working traffic light. A school with a flag at half-mast for no occasion anyone had bothered to update. A bail bonds office wedged between a laundromat and a shuttered video store. Its neon sign the only thing in 3 blocks still lit at that hour. A town tells you what it's afraid of, long before it tells you what it's proud of, if you know where to look. Colton County had a bail bonds office bigger than its library. That alone would have been enough to justify the trip. Adele Marsh had spent 19 years learning that the loudest version of a town's story is rarely the true one. She'd been a field agent in Cleveland, a supervisor in Atlanta, an assistant director in the criminal division before the president nominated her for deputy director 11 weeks before that Tuesday morning. Her mother, Ruth Marsh, no relation to the diner owner, a coincidence Adele would think about more than once in the days ahead, had spent 31 years as a public defender in Baltimore, coming home most nights too exhausted to eat, telling her daughter at the kitchen table about clients who'd been arrested for the crime of looking like they didn't belong somewhere. Adele had grown up watching her mother carry those stories like stones in her coat pockets, and she had promised herself, long before she owned a badge of her own, that if she was ever handed real power, she would use it to go looking for the counties nobody else was checking on. Ruth Marsh had died 4 years before her daughter was sworn in, but Adele still kept one of her mother's old case files in a drawer at home. Not for sentiment, exactly, or not only for that, but as a kind of instrument calibration, a reminder of the baseline she was measuring every new town against. The file belonged to a 19-year-old named Terrence Whitfield, arrested in 1994 for loitering outside a convenience store 4 blocks from his own house, held for 2 days before anyone told his mother where he was. Ruth Marsh had gotten the charges dropped in 11 minutes once she finally got him in front of a judge. She had come home that night, Adele remembered, and sat at the kitchen table without taking her coat off, saying almost nothing, just turning her wedding ring around and around on her finger until it left a groove in the skin. That was the moment, more than any speech, that had told a 12-year-old Adele exactly what kind of work mattered. That was why, 11 weeks into the job, instead of settling into the 7th floor office with the view of the Potomac, she had asked her chief of staff for something almost nobody in her position ever requested: the states, the counties, the ZP codes where complaint numbers had been climbing for years with no federal review ever opened. Colton County, Wyoming, population 19,000 across 4 incorporated towns, sat near the top of that list. Not because of one dramatic incident, but because of a pattern an analyst had flagged almost as an afterthought. The county detained residents at nearly triple the rate of comparable counties its size. Fewer than 6% of those attentions ever became a case a prosecutor would touch. 2 federal civil complaints, filed 4 years apart, by different families, both dismissed for lack of follow-through. A scatter of anonymous letters that had sat in a regional office's drawer, because nobody had time to read them until Adele's team started asking why the drawer existed at all. None of it, on its own, was proof of anything. Together, it was enough to justify exactly the kind of visit nobody puts in a press release. No announcement, no local field office notified, no advance car with government plates rolling down Main Street to tip off exactly the people she needed to see behaving naturally. She rented a gray Chevrolet Malibu under her own name at the airport in Casper. She wore a coat that had belonged to her mother, soft at the elbows, unremarkable in every way. She drove the last 40 minutes into Millhaven Ridge in the dark, watching the county introduce itself in details rather than words. A boarded-up feed store, a single blinking light at the town's only real intersection, 3 patrol trucks parked outside a diner at an hour when a town that size should have needed exactly 1. There was a 4th truck, too, idling in the gravel lot of a self-storage facility a half-mile outside town, and Adele slowed just enough to note the plate before she kept driving. She wasn't looking for anything specific yet. She was building a floor plan in her head, the way she always did, where the power in a place liked to park itself, and where it thought nobody was watching. In Colton County, apparently, the answer was everywhere, and it didn't much care who saw. Her phone buzzed once with the 9 check-in reminder from her protective detail. She sent back a single word, "Fine," the way she always did on these trips, and did not think about it again. It would be the last message she sent for the next 6 hours and 11 minutes. though she had no way of knowing that yet. Sitting in a rented Malibu across from a diner, with its lights just coming on, watching as a waitress flipped the sign in the window from closed to open. She parked across the street just after 6 and sat behind the wheel for a few minutes, the way she always did before walking into somewhere new, letting the town wake up around her. Porch lights clicking off one by one, a school bus idling 2 blocks down, a dog barking at nothing in particular. It was, she would tell people much later, the last ordinary morning Millhaven Ridge would have for a very long time. Inside, the diner smelled like burnt coffee and bacon grease, and the particular mustiness of carpet that had been vacuumed for 30 years, but never replaced. Ruth Callahan moved between 4 occupied booths with a pot in each hand, calling customers by name the way she'd done since she inherited the place from her father. When Adele walked in, Ruth gave her the same nod she gave every stranger passing through on the highway. Pure, unthinking hospitality that asked no questions because it expected none in return. Adele took the window booth, ordered without fuss, and pulled out her notebook. She wrote almost nothing dramatic. The rhythm of the room, the way 2 farmers at the counter lowered their voices whenever the radio on the counter crackled with a dispatch call, the way a woman in scrubs, clearly heading toward a shift change at the county clinic, flinched. Actually flinched, shoulders rising toward her ears, when a patrol truck rolled slowly past the window outside. Small things. But Adele had learned a long time ago that small things were the only things that hadn't been rehearsed for an audience. She watched an elderly man in a canvas jacket order the same thing he'd apparently ordered every morning for years, without needing to say it out loud. Ruth already had the ticket half written before he sat down. She watched a teenage boy in a mechanic's jumpsuit eat alone at the counter, headphones in, careful not to make eye contact with anyone. The particular posture of someone who has learned that being noticed rarely goes well for him. She watched all of it the way she'd watched 100 other towns over 19 years, filing each detail into the part of her mind that never really turned off, even on a morning that was supposed to be nothing but breakfast and a long drive still ahead of her. If you had asked her, in that moment, what she expected to happen in Millhaven Ridge, she would have told you the truth, that most of these visits ended in nothing at all. A quiet morning, a quiet drive back to the airport, a file closed with a note that said no actionable pattern observed. She had learned to hope for that outcome, even as her job required her to keep looking for its opposite. She did not know yet that this particular morning had already started its countdown, and that the man responsible for it hadn't even walked through the door. Then the bell over the door rang harder than it needed to, and Sheriff Wade Garner filled the doorway the way he filled every room he'd ever walked into. Chest first, eyes already hunting for something to correct. He was 56, built like a man who had never once stopped to consider that intimidation and leadership were different things. He had in his own mind a code. He tipped Ruth well, remembered the names of every kid on the high school football team, drove 20 minutes out to check on old Curtis Hale's cattle fence himself when it blew down in a windstorm 2 winters back. People who knew him only through those moments would have sworn, hand on a Bible, that Wade Garner was a good man. It was the other version of him, the one that showed up only for strangers, who didn't fit the picture he carried of, who belonged in his county, that nobody in Millhaven Ridge liked to talk about out loud. His eyes swept the diner out of habit, cataloging every face he already knew, until they landed on Adele, a black woman he'd never seen before, sitting alone by the window, writing quietly in a notebook nobody in Millhaven Ridge had asked her to explain. Something in his jaw tightened. He didn't walk over right away. He stood by the counter instead, watching her the way a man watches something he has already decided is a problem, gathering evidence for a verdict he'd reached before he had any facts at all. Ruth noticed the shift in him and felt something twist low in her stomach. She'd felt it before, plenty of times, and she said nothing, because saying something to Wade Garner had never once, in 22 years, changed a single thing about how his morning went. Remember that mug behind the counter with the crack down the side. It's going to matter later, and you'll want to have noticed it here first. Wade didn't approach for nearly 10 minutes, and in a smaller story, that gap might have meant something. Restraint, maybe, or second thoughts. It meant neither. He was simply finishing his own coffee first, letting the tension build in a room that had no idea it was already holding its breath. The same way he liked to let a suspect sit in an interview room a little longer than necessary before he opened the door. When he finally crossed the diner floor, his boots were loud on purpose. "Help you find something, ma'am," he said, close enough that Ruth, 2 booths away, stopped moving entirely. Adele looked up, unhurried, the way she'd trained herself to do for 19 years, in rooms far more hostile than a diner in Wyoming. "Just breakfast," she said. "You local?" "Passing through." Passing through from where? It wasn't a question anymore. It hadn't been for several sentences. Wade planted one hand on the back of the booth across from her, leaning in close enough that his shadow fell across her notebook, and asked to see identification. Not because any law required it, not because she'd done anything, but because he had decided, the moment he walked through that door, that a stranger, who looked like her, sitting alone, writing quietly, was something he needed to correct before his town woke up any further around her. Adele reached, slowly, deliberately, into her coat, and that single motion was enough. Wade's hand went to his belt. "Hands where I can see them," he said, loud enough now that every fork in the diner stopped moving. "I'm reaching for my ID," Adele said. Her voice did not rise. That, more than anything, seemed to make him angrier. What happened over the next 4 minutes would later be described, in a federal filing, as an escalating and unjustified use of force against a compliant individual exhibiting no threat indicators. Which is the kind of sentence that tells you everything and nothing at all about what it actually felt like to sit in that booth while it happened. Wade pulled her up out of the seat by the arm, hard enough to knock the notebook to the floor. He turned her, pressed her palms flat against the cold window glass in front of 11 witnesses, and cuffed her wrists behind her back, so tight the metal bit into skin. He recited nothing about rights. He said, instead, loud enough for the whole room, that this was exactly the kind of thing that happened when strangers thought they could just walk into somebody's town like they owned it. 2 customers had their phones out before he finished the sentence. Ruth stood frozen behind the counter, coffee pot still in her hand, the crack in that mug catching the morning light for exactly as long as the room stayed silent. And the room stayed silent for a very long time. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The radio on the counter kept crackling with a dispatch call. Nobody was listening to anymore, and somewhere outside, a school bus pulled away from the curb, oblivious. As if the whole world hadn't just narrowed down to one window booth and the sound of handcuffs closing. That is the first frozen moment of this story. Hold on to it, because there's a second one coming, and it will feel very different. Wade marched her out through the diner with one hand clamped around her upper arm, past tables of people who had known him 22 years, and, in that moment, could not meet his eyes. He put her in the back of his patrol truck himself, slammed the door, and stood on the sidewalk for a second, chest rising and falling, looking almost satisfied. A man who believed, completely and without a flicker of doubt, that he had just done his job. He drove her not to a booking desk, but to a holding cell in the basement of the county building, a cinderblock room with one bare bulb and a bench bolted to the wall, and he left her there for 6 hours before anyone came to ask her a single question. No phone call, no paperwork filed, no name entered into any system that would have told him, in under 90 seconds, exactly who he had locked in that room. For the first hour, Adele said nothing at all, because she had learned long ago that the first hour in a room like that is not for talking, it's for cataloging. She noted the water stain on the ceiling, shaped like the state of Ohio. She noted that the bolt on the bench had been replaced at some point with a mismatched one, slightly too large. The kind of detail that told her this cell got more use than the county would ever admit in a budget meeting. She noted the absence of a camera and understood, more clearly than anything else in that room, exactly what that absence meant about how things were normally done down here. By hour 2, she had started counting the seams in the cinder block instead, because counting was the only thing that kept the anger from turning into something less useful. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice when Wade Garner walked past the cell twice without looking in. She sat, hands folded in her lap despite the cuffs, back straight against cold cinder block, and she waited with the particular stillness of someone who has decided, consciously, that her composure is the only weapon in the room nobody can take from her. Deputy Silas Boone, 29 years old, 3 years into the job, brought her a cup of water around hour 3 and stood in the doorway a moment too long, like he wanted to say something and didn't have the words or the nerve for it yet. "You want me to at least log an intake number?" he asked, quiet enough that it wouldn't carry up the stairs. It was the only kindness offered to her in that basement, and it was also, in its own small way, an act of defiance. Because Wade Garner had specifically told him not to bother, that they'd sort the paperwork once she'd cooperated. Silas logged it anyway, on a sheet he kept folded in his own jacket pocket, rather than the department binder. A decision that would matter enormously 3 days later. He would think about that hesitation and that folded sheet of paper for the rest of his life. By hour 5, 2 more deputies had come down to look at her through the small wired glass window in the door. The way people look at something in a zoo enclosure, murmuring to each other in the hallway, just loud enough for her to catch fragments. She still hasn't given a name. Wade says she's stonewalling. Wade says this happens more than you'd think. Adele memorized both of their voices. She would recognize them again 3 days later, across a conference table, and neither man would meet her eyes. At 12:52 in the afternoon, the cell door finally opened again. Not because Wade Garner had reconsidered anything, but because a phone had started ringing in 3 different offices at once, and none of them belonged to the county. Here is what Wade Garner did not know, standing over that cell with his arms crossed, waiting for an apology that was never going to come. Adele Marsh had a driver, a real one. A federal protective detail that maintained contact with her every 4 hours during unannounced travel, exactly for situations like this one. When she missed her 9:0 check-in, the detail didn't panic. Protocol first meant confirming her location through the rental car's telematics, which placed her, unmoving, at an address that turned out to be the Colton County Sheriff's Office. By 10:15, a call had gone to the FBI's Denver field office. By 11:30, that call had reached the U.S. Attorney for the District of Wyoming. By 12:40, 3 vehicles were 40 minutes out from Millhaven Ridge, and the county attorney, a soft-spoken man named Harlan Voss, who had spent 11 years quietly avoiding conflict with Wade Garner, had already been informed, in a voice that left no room for negotiation, exactly whose office had jurisdiction now. Wade found out the way he found out most things that eventually humbled him, too late, and from someone he outranked. Special Agent in Charge Priyanandan walked into that basement at 12:52, with 2 agents behind her and a printed photograph in her hand, and she did not raise her voice, because she had learned a long time ago that the coldest thing you can do to a man like Wade Garner is refuse to give him the fight he's braced for. "Sheriff Garner," she said, "you've had Deputy Director Adele Marsh of the Federal Bureau of Investigation in an unlogged holding cell for 6 hours and 11 minutes. I need you to remove those cuffs right now. For 1 full second, nothing in that basement moved. That's the second frozen moment. The bare bulb humming overhead. Wade's mouth half open around a sentence he never finished. Deputy Boone standing very still by the stairs, with an expression somewhere between relief and horror, and Adele Marsh sitting on that bench with her wrists still cuffed, watching the color drain out of a face that had never once, in 22 years, had to consider the possibility that it was wrong. Agent Nandon crouched down, unlocked the cuffs herself rather than handing the key to Wade, and helped Adele to her feet with a hand under her elbow, quiet and businesslike, the way you'd help a colleague up from a fall rather than a rescued hostage. Because that, more than anything, was the tone Adele wanted set in that basement. Not triumph, not spectacle, just the correction of a fact that should never have needed correcting in the first place. Wade did not apologize. He would not apologize for another 11 days, and when he finally did, it would be the kind of apology lawyers write, not the kind people mean. What he said, standing in that basement with the cuffs still dangling from his own hand because he'd been too stunned to pass them off, was, "I was following procedure. She wouldn't identify herself fast enough. I don't know what you want me to say." That sentence, "I don't know what you want me to say," would end up quoted in 3 different news segments over the following month, and every single time, it would be presented as exactly what it was. A man mistaking stubbornness for principle, right up until the moment stubbornness cost him everything. Adele stood, rubbed the raw skin at her wrists, and did not ask for an apology, because she had learned long before that morning that people like Wade or Garner rarely have one worth waiting for. What she asked for instead was a list. Every arrest Colton County had made in the last 3 years. Every complaint that had ever been filed against the department and quietly closed, and every deputy currently on shift. Harlan Voss, the county attorney, delivered that list himself within the hour, hands trembling slightly as he handed over a banker's box of files he had spent a decade pretending not to notice. What the box revealed, over the following 72 hours of a federal review that moved faster than almost anyone in Millhaven Ridge had ever seen government move, was worse than anyone in that diner could have imagined watching Wade Garner cuff a stranger over eggs and coffee. 14 documented complaints in 6 years, 11 of them from Black or Latino residents and travelers passing through on the interstate. Every single one closed within a week with no investigation attached. 2 lawsuits settled quietly using county insurance money, both sealed by agreements that kept them out of the local paper. A pattern an analyst would later testify was consistent. It was less like misconduct and more like a policy nobody had ever needed to write down, because everyone in the department already understood what was expected without being told. The news reached Millhaven Ridge in the way news always does in a town that's small. Sideways, in fragments, faster than any official statement could keep up with. By that evening, half the county had watched the 11-second phone video of the cuffing at least once, and the other half had heard about it from someone who had. The diner's phone rang 31 times before Ruth finally unplugged it. 2 reporters from the Casper station showed up outside the sheriff's office by Wednesday morning, and by Thursday, a van from a cable network had parked itself outside the community hall, waiting for a statement nobody in local government yet knew how to give. Wade Garner, for his part, spent those first 2 days convinced the story would blow over the way every other story about him always had. He gave one interview to the county's weekly paper in which he used the word procedure 9 times and the word sorry not once. He told his deputies, in a meeting Silas Boone would later describe under oath, that the woman had clearly known how to work a room and that federal agents loved a good headline as much as anybody. He was, in that meeting, already rehearsing the version of the story where he came out the hero of it. a version that would collapse within 72 hours, but that he clung to, in one form or another, for months afterward. Ruth Callahan, when federal investigators came to the diner 2 days later to ask what she'd witnessed, did not hesitate. She pulled the security footage from the camera above the register herself, before anyone even asked for it, and handed over the flash drive, along with a folded napkin on which she'd written down, from memory, every word Wade Garner had said in the 4 minutes it took him to put a stranger in handcuffs. "I should have said something," she told the agent, taking her statement, her voice steady even as her hands were not. "I've been telling myself for 20 years that staying quiet was the same as staying out of it. It isn't. It never was." Deputy Silas Boone gave his statement without being asked twice. He described the cell, the 6 hours, the water he'd brought at hour 3, and the sentence he hadn't had the courage to finish. He also handed over something nobody had requested, a personal notebook kept against department policy, where he'd been quietly logging incidents he considered wrong for the better part of 18 months. Because he hadn't known who else to tell, and hadn't trusted the chain of command he was inside of. That dude's notebook, more than almost anything else, was what turned a single, humiliating morning into a federal case that would eventually name 6 current and former Colton County deputies. Mayor Denise Falk called an emergency town meeting for that Friday evening, and by 6:45, the Millhaven Ridge Community Hall was full for the first time anyone could remember since a wildfire evacuation 4 years earlier. Folding chairs ran out before 7. People stood 3 deep along the back wall, coats still on, the particular hush of a room that knows it's about to hear something it can't unhear. Denise Falk, 61 years old and mayor for the past 9, stood at the podium with a single index card in her hand that she never once looked down at, because by that point she didn't need notes to say what needed saying. "I have known Wade Garner for 30 years, she told the room, her voice steady, even as her hands gripped the podium edge hard enough to whiten her knuckles. "I voted for him 5 times. I am not proud of what that means right now, and I don't expect any of you to be either. What I am is done pretending this town didn't know." A murmur ran through the crowd, not agreement exactly, but something close to it. The sound of a room finally allowed to say out loud what it had spent years only saying in kitchens and truck cabs, low enough that it never had to become a real conversation. Adele Marsh stood at the front of that room, in the same gray coat she'd worn into the diner 4 days earlier, and she did not talk about the arrest. She did not describe the cell, or the 6 hours, or the mark the cuffs had left on her wrists that still hadn't fully faded. She talked instead about the difference between power used lawfully and power used out of habit. A difference, she said, that cannot survive in silence, because silence is where habits like Wade Garner's are allowed to calcify into something that looks, from the inside, like order. She looked out at the room, at faces she recognized from the diner 4 days earlier. The farmers who'd lowered their voices at the radio, the woman in scrubs who'd flinched at the patrol truck, and she told them, gently but without softening it, that she understood exactly why so many of them had stayed quiet for so long. Fear of losing a job in a county with only a handful of employers. Fear of being the next person a patrol truck slowed down for. Fear, simplest of all, of being wrong about a man everyone else still trusted. None of those fears made anyone a bad person, she said. But fear was also, she reminded them, the exact material silence is built from, and silence was the only real tool Wade Garner had ever needed. She told the room that federal oversight of the Colton County Sheriff's Department would remain in place for no less than 3 years, with quarterly public reporting, an independent complaint line that bypassed local leadership entirely, and a full audit of every arrest made in the county over the previous 5 years. Not because she wanted to punish a town, she said, but because a town that had spent 22 years afraid to question it One man deserved the chance to build something it could actually trust. An older man near the back, a rancher named Curtis Hale, who had known Wade Garner since grade school, raised his hand and asked, in a voice thick with something between guilt and grief, what they were all supposed to do now. How you rebuild trust in an institution you've just learned, spent years quietly betraying it. Adele considered the question with the same unhurried patience she'd shown a sheriff who'd never once earned it. Trust, she told him, isn't restored with a statement or a ceremony. It's restored through years of small, verifiable decisions, made correctly, long after anyone outside is still paying attention. It would not happen quickly. It would not happen because anyone declared it finished. A woman near the front, a nurse named Odessa Price, who had filed one of the 2 civil complaints that had been quietly settled and sealed 4 years earlier, stood up on her own, without being called on. Her voice shook for the first sentence and then steadied. I filed a complaint about Sheriff Garner in 2022, she said. I was told there wasn't enough evidence. I have been driving 40 extra minutes every single day since then to avoid this county's patrol routes on my way to work. I want to know why it took a federal official in handcuffs for anyone to finally believe me. Nobody in that room had an answer for her. Adele Marsh, standing at the front, did not offer platitudes. She simply told Odessa Price that her original complaint would be the first file reopened under the new independent review, and that she would receive a call within the week, a promise that was kept to the day. Ruth Callahan sat near the back of that hall, beside 2 of her regular customers, and felt something in her chest loosen for the first time in longer than she could remember. The particular relief of watching a wrong get named out loud, in front of every person who needed to hear it. Wade Garner was not in that room. By the time Mayor Falk called the meeting to order, he had already been placed on unpaid administrative leave, pending a federal indictment on charges that would eventually include deprivation of rights under color of law, falsification of records, and obstruction. He was escorted out of the count building 4 days after the diner, in front of a much smaller crowd than the one that had watched him make his arrest, and he said, one final time, to the 2 agents walking him to the car, that he had only ever been doing his job. Nobody in that parking lot believed him, including, by the flat look in his own eyes, some small part of himself. Deputy Silas Boone was appointed acting sheriff on an interim basis. 9 days later, a decision the town met with cautious relief rather than celebration, still adjusting to the idea that authority could be questioned and corrected instead of simply obeyed. He opened public office hours twice a week, almost immediately, sitting at a plain folding table in the community hall, listening more than he spoke, writing down every complaint, whether or not it seemed important at first. Something Millhaven Ridge had never once seen from its sheriff's department in living memory. Ruth reopened the diner 3 days after the meeting, uncertain whether anyone would come back, given everything that had happened under her own roof. They did. Slowly at first, then steadily, tables filling again, as the town relearned the particular rhythm of an ordinary morning, 1 coffee refill at a time. She kept the cracked mug on the shelf behind the register, out of rotation, where customers could see it, but never be served from it, and when people asked why, she only ever said it reminded her to keep her eyes open. Most people, sensing there was a longer story behind it, let the matter rest. Adele Marsh came back to that diner one final time before she left Millhaven Ridge for good, sliding into the same window booth, ordering the same breakfast. Black coffee, 2 eggs, 1 slice of toast. This time, the moment she sat down, something in the room shifted immediately. Recognition swept the diner, old customers and new, and one by one, without anyone directing them to, people rose to their feet. It wasn't deference to her title. There were no cameras there to perform for. It was something quieter, an acknowledgement of the composure she had carried through every minute of that first morning, the steadiness that had exposed a truth the town had spent 22 years choosing not to see. Ruth poured her coffee with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear this time, but from something closer to gratitude, the kind that doesn't need many words to be understood. An elderly woman 2 booths away leaned toward her husband and whispered that she wished she'd said something that first morning, that she'd sat in that very diner and watched the whole thing happen without ever once opening her mouth. Adele overheard it, the way she overheard most things, and offered the woman only a small, understanding nod. It wasn't her place to absolve anyone of their silence. That, she had come to believe over 19 years of doing this work, was a debt each person owed only to themselves. She finished breakfast in the same unhurried quiet she'd arrived with 4 days earlier, thanked Ruth by name, and walked out into a morning far clearer than the gray one that had greeted her that first Tuesday. Her rented Malibu was still parked exactly where she'd left it. Within minutes, she was gone, disappearing down the same quiet highway that had carried her in, leaving behind a town that would never again mistake a badge for permission. In the weeks between his arrest and his plea, Wade Garner tried twice to reach Adele Marsh directly, once through his attorney, requesting a private meeting he framed as an opportunity to clear the air, and once, astonishingly, through a handwritten letter delivered to the FBI's Denver field office, in which he wrote that he hoped she could someday understand that a man his age couldn't be expected to change overnight. Adele read the letter once, in full, standing in a hallway outside a conference room, and did not read what it said. She did not need to. The letter itself, entered later as an exhibit at the request of federal prosecutors, became one of the clearest pieces of evidence that Wade Garner, even facing the collapse of everything he'd built, still could not locate the words "I was wrong" anywhere inside himself. Only I couldn't be expected. Wade Garner pleaded guilty 8 months later to reduced federal charges rather than face trial, accepting a sentence that included restitution, a permanent ban from any position in law enforcement, and 18 months in a minimum security facility, 300 miles from the only town he'd ever called home. He never once, across the entire process, said the words "I was wrong." At his sentencing, given the chance to speak, he told the courtroom he still believed he'd been protecting his community. The federal judge, a woman not much younger than Adele Marsh, looked at him for a long moment before responding that a badge does not grant power beyond the law, only the responsibility to uphold it faithfully, and that the saddest part of his case wasn't the 22 years of habit behind it, but his complete inability, even now, to imagine that he might have been the danger all along. Odessa Price's case, once reopened, turned out to be the first thread in a much longer rope. 2 more residents came forward within the month, then 4 more, then a name investigators hadn't even had on their list. A trucker named Elias Cordero, who had been detained overnight in that same basement cell 18 months earlier over a taillight that, according to the department's own maintenance log, had never actually been broken. By the time the federal review concluded, 11 separate individuals had given statements, and the county's insurance carrier quietly informed Mayor Falk that Colton County's liability premiums would be tripling regardless of the outcome of any single case, because the pattern itself, once documented, could no longer be treated as a series of unfortunate coincidences. Colton County's Sheriff's Department underwent the most sweeping reform in its history over the following year. Oversight tightened. Procedures were rewritten from the ground up. Accountability, for the first time, had actual teeth instead of a plaque on a wall nobody had ever bothered to read closely. Silas Boone, elected sheriff in his own right the following November, kept that flash drive of security footage in a locked drawer in his desk. Not as evidence anymore, the case long since closed, but as a reminder, he told a reporter once, of exactly how easily an ordinary morning could turn into the worst day of somebody's life. and how much it costs a town when good people decide silence is the safer choice. Deputy Boone's folded sheet of paper. The intake log Wade Garner had told him not to bother keeping became, in the end, one of the two pieces of evidence the federal prosecutor cited by name in her closing argument, the other being the 11 seconds of shaky phone video shot from a booth 3 tables away from where it all started. Silas kept a photocopy of that sheet in the same desk drawer as the flash drive. Not because the case needed it anymore, but because some part of him understood that the paper represented the exact moment he'd stopped being someone who just did what he was told. Adele Marsh left no farewell speech behind in Millhaven Ridge, no dramatic final statement for the cameras that had started showing up by the second day and never really left. She left only the quiet example of one unhurried morning that had unraveled 22 years of hidden injustice, and a cracked mug on a shelf behind a diner counter that nobody ever used again, but that nobody could quite bring themselves to throw away either. Somewhere down another highway, in another small town that had not yet learned to question anything, a similar morning was already waiting to unfold. Another quiet stranger about to sit down in another window booth, another badge about to make a decision it wouldn't understand the weight of until it was far too late to take back. That was the part of the job Adele Marsh never spoke about publicly. The part her mother had understood decades before she ever wore a badge of her own. That the list never actually ends. That every county she cleared only revealed 2 more she hadn't reached yet. And that the work wasn't about finishing something. It was about making sure someone kept showing up. She moved on to the next county on a list that, she knew better than anyone, was still far too long, carrying nothing but a notebook, a coat that had once belonged to her mother, and the understanding that real justice rarely announces itself with noise. It arrives quietly, it waits, and it never ever answers to a badge worn without a conscience.